Okay, I will now give my thoughts about other concerns that people may have found objectionable from my previous video, which Grim Grizz said was raw and half-cooked ideas, and I don't disagree because I was somewhat rambling. But this is to clarify that. Okay, first of all, if someone is gay, that does not mean that they cannot be a Christian. And I believe, we all have a choice of how we identify ourselves. If you choose to identify yourself first and foremost by your sexual preferences, then that's not keeping in line with the Christian way of thinking. So I would say if a person is attracted to people of the same sex, whether they are doing anything about that or not, and they are Christian, they should identify themselves as a Christian who happens to have that attraction. Secondly, I think that the Bible is pretty clear that all sins are not excusable, they are forgivable. But when we are aware of something that we're doing that is sinful and we make no effort towards stopping it, that is not the appropriate response. And that's like Peter said that some of you have not resisted to the point of shedding blood, which I think is going along with what Jesus was saying, which was probably somewhat hyperbolic, but when he said that if your right hand causes you to sin, you should cut it off because it's better to enter the kingdom of heaven with one hand than not to make it at all. So what is that to say? That if you know something is wrong, you should work as hard as you can to keep yourself from doing that. And as Chad and Lance described in their video in regards to someone who has a struggle with alcohol, it's not smart to try to go to a bar and try not to drink. You would be far better off to not put yourself in the environment where it's even possible for you to be tempted to drink. So you go to someplace with no alcohol. And I think that that's perfectly good advice, and it's not to say that you will never, you therefore must never enter a place where you may be exposed to temptation, because it may be that you do have to for higher reasons than your sobriety or keeping yourself from sinning. And so that's okay. You can make an idol out of your rigorous attempts to keep yourself from sinning through effort of will. I think that's pretty clear based on teachings of Jesus and others in the New Testament as well. So there's no problem with a person being to whatever degree a person has attraction to the same sex. That does not preclude them from being a Christian or doing many things within Christianity. Their choice of how they act on it is another matter. Do I think that gay people should not have children? No, I don't think that. I think gay people should have children. If they want to have children, wanting to have children is a good desire. However, the way that God created this system to work is that in order to have children, a man and a woman must have sexual intercourse. So if for a gay man who's attracted to other men, their desire to have children should supersede their desire to only sleep with other men. And if that is too big of a sacrifice for them to make, then it's doubtful if they would be able to make the necessary sacrifices to raise children in a correct way. Unless if you're Genghis Khan, pretty much all of us were conceived by parents who, to a certain extent, had to suppress their highest desire, at least on some level, mainly we can say biological, in order to have children at all. And in speaking regards to the men, this would be to say Jordan Peterson's statements that we have a biological preference for women with a 0.68 waist to hip ratio and symmetrical features and all this other stuff. So and whatever causes women to prefer one man over another, them being a surgeon or a vampire, at a certain point, some level of compromise is made so that a person can settle down and be with someone and have children. And those who are too picky do not end up having children. And that's just, if your standards are too high means they're higher than is good. It keeps you from ever reproducing. So that's, even from a Darwinian standpoint, the selection mechanism may be good for preferring a certain set of genes over another, but if it's not calibrated realistic to what is available, it's not going to work. Do I think that gay people should not be allowed to adopt children? No, I don't think that that is necessarily wrong, that no gay people should ever be able to adopt children. For instance, many times, if children become orphaned due to tragic circumstances and they have family, that is usually the best choice for who should adopt and take care of those children. So if a gay man, suddenly, their brother or sister and the spouse of that person loses their life, and they have the opportunity to adopt and take care of their nieces and nephews, I think that that would be a good thing to do, and that would be perfectly acceptable. I also think that if a gay person wants to adopt in general, even if they are not a Christian and they're living, with another gay person, I think that that is not necessarily a bad thing. I do think that desiring to be a parent is a good thing, and I do believe that the method of adoption is a good thing, especially for those children who don't have other options. So this is where I would put one sticking point, is that I would say the biggest preference in people looking to adopt is the desire to adopt newborns. And the greatest need of children to be adopted is not newborns, but it is older children. And so I think that gay people should maybe, because I believe that, and you don't have to use the Bible to make this case, but like even Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin to a certain degree agreed that the optimum is a man and a woman, a father and a child and a mother for a child, then preference for the adoption of newborns should go to married couples who are not able to have their own children. I think that should be preferred, through whatever agencies and things like that, before a child is adopted by a gay couple. Um, and I think that the any resistance towards the idea of towards that idea, or unwillingness to consider being a foster parent or adopting an older child, should be looked at as a suspicious thing, because we don't always get to have our preferences in life. That's not the way life works. So preferentially, though a gay person or a gay couple may desire to adopt an infant, if they have to adopt a slightly older or much older child, I think that should be an acceptable choice for them. I don't think that it's necessary, or they can not adopt at all. I think any arguments that Christians will use about things like the inappropriateness of potential sexual abuse, I think is should not be a primary concern, because that could always be a potential for anybody who's adopting children, whether they're gay or straight. And we have to have a level of trust in society that says people who desire to be parents know that a parental relationship to a child is, by design, not a sexual relationship, and that would be an inappropriate boundary. Now, I do think that it would be wise, and probably not just for gay couples, but for other couples as well, to have systems, which I know they do have, to check on the situation with, especially with foster children and older children who are closer to being sexually mature in age. That's a good system to have in place. But we have to assume that somebody's desire to be a parent does not mean that they are desiring to be an abuser. And unfortunately, those people already exist, and they are prevalent in the foster care system. So if it can be expressed and you can honestly communicate that your desire is to be a good parent, to provide a good household for a child, then I think that shouldn't be necessarily a barrier. And I do think there is some potential concern you could bring up about the fact that there is if there is in your own personal history traumatic abuse scenarios, then that should be something where it requires more closely being monitored. But it is not necessarily true that all victims of abuse become abusers. And I think that in some instances that is the case, and then in other instances that person becomes the person farthest from reenacting that scenario. But that probably has a lot to do with how they have processed whatever history of abuse is in their past. Now, this gets to the final kind of piece of this thing, which is this concept of adopting babies through surrogacy, through egg donors or sperm and egg donors, and then the use of a surrogate in whatever scenario. If this is the sort of scenario where it's a sibling choosing to do this for their for another sibling, then I think that's a much more understandable situation. I think that there's definitely Christian ethical concerns about it, but the legal scenario is a little more clear, because in that sense it is still an adoption of a close relative in a way, depending on whether it's just the use of a surrogate that's related to you, or if also they are supplying genetic components. But when it gets to the situation of, donated genetic components, or which are ultimately, donated by one person and then somebody else is paying for them, whether they call it paying for it or whatever, that's what it is. It's a transaction of money for genetic components and transactional use of another person's womb. At that point, it's hard to explain, except through legalese, how this is not the buying and selling of human beings. And the buying and selling of human beings is something that we should be opposed to, because it is done against their will. It is a form of slavery. Even if they are raised as a child, with the rights of a child, it is still the transaction of buying a human being. And if the excuse for it would be that those childs are going to be treated well, then that means that it was wrong to criticize slave owners in the past who treated their slaves well, because because they suffered on behalf of the slave owners who treated their slaves poorly. Now, I don't know how many that was, but there is some evidence, at least, that very godly people who happened to have slaves in time past treated their slaves very well. And that being a slave in certain households, and I'm not necessarily saying American slavery or prior historical slaveries, would have been preferential to somebody being on their own, where they would have had very little means to support themselves. So that the treatment of the person is not necessarily the thing that makes it wrong. It is the transactional approach of it. And buying and selling people is wrong, because a person has unmeasurable value. And when we put a measurement on that person's life, we reduce their humanity to the level of being a commodity. And the very fact of that, when a child becomes an adult and they're aware of that situation, is going to cause a certain level of psychological harm to them. And that's why I think that we need to examine these things very critically and not just defer to, well, this is kind, it's kind, and it's good to accept that this is happening, and look at what wonderful parents these people are, caring for this child, when they've done many things that show no willingness to defer their own preferences for the sake of another person. And therefore, it's hard to see how ultimately they are exhibiting the characteristics of what makes a good parent, because that willingness to sacrifice your own preferences for the good of another is absolutely the role of a mother in the child rearing position. And so and this is where it gets especially more toward, because I guess, you could say for the most part, women who are attracted to other women but who decide to have a child are probably going to bear that child themselves. And there's no really any doubt about them being the mother of that child. But in the circumstance of a gay male couple, if they're not willing to defer any of their preferences for the sake of what is best for that child, then they are depriving that child of a mother in actuality, and exhibiting the fact that they do not share the characteristics of what makes a good mother, and therefore they should not be considered highly as a good candidate to be raising a child. So I think that everything I've said is fairly reasonable. You have to decide if legal principles are higher than spiritual values, but at the same time, without some sort of a spiritual, or a God-like authority behind your legal system, there's no way to enforce or have any standard of morality in there. So, in that case, it seems very much like what you would get, and what we do in fact have, is that those who can afford to do what they want get to do what they want. And I don't think that is a very good system for our society and how to operate. And final point I want to make is in regards to surrogacy and women who decide to be surrogates. If it's for an altruistic reason, that's one thing. It's an understandable thing. But for those who are doing it as a means of financial betterment, which is the majority, they are already in a position of coercion, really, because they may have no other options except starvation or losing their home, or not being able to pay rent, or some less savory means like prostitution. So it is a manipulative scenario. And if a woman has never been pregnant and had a child, there's not really a consent form that can be informed for her to be required to give up that baby. Even though chances are, she's probably in a catch-22 where she becomes pregnant for the sake of making money, and if she does not deliver the baby to the buyers of the baby, she's not going to be able to afford to raise the child. So if she has a change of heart for emotional reasons, the financial situation is going to force her hand. So that is, in essence, compelled behavior. It's a form of slavery, or bondage, indentured servitude for both the mother and the child to a certain degree. So those are final thoughts on this